He came to the mountains to outrun memories, but the past has a long shadow, and it follows even the quietest men into the most silent places. He was a man who had made a career of moving through the world without being seen, a ghost in the architecture of conflict. But the one thing he could not slip past was the echo in his own mind. So he came here, to the jagged spine of Montana, where the wind scoured the rock clean, and the silence was so profound it felt like a physical presence. He hoped that in all that emptiness, the single, repeating echo of his failure might finally fade. He was not looking for a fight. He was not looking for a cause. He was looking for an ending. But his canine, a veteran himself with a muzzle turning the color of ash, froze one morning, his head cocked toward the ridge. He had found something that did not belong, a whisper of wrongness on the clean air. And in that discovery, a new story began. Not of an ending, but of a long-delayed beginning. It would become a story about a secret, buried in steel and rust, a voice that refused to be silenced, and the moral choice that confronts a man who believes he has no choices left. Elias Thorne moved through the lodgepole pines with an economy of motion that was second nature. His worn leather boots made little sound on the carpet of dry needles. At 46, he was a man carved from the hard parts of the world, lean and corded with the kind of strength that was not for show, but for endurance. His olive field jacket, the same one he had worn for a decade, was less a piece of clothing than a second skin, its pockets holding the small, essential tools of his existence: a folding knife, a compass, a waterproof case with matches. On his wrist, the heavy steel of a military-issue watch ticked with relentless precision, a constant reminder of time lost, time wasted, time he was now trying to let bleed away into the vast, indifferent landscape. His backpack, an Eberly stock half-track, was packed with the Spartan discipline of a dozen deployments. Everything in its place, everything with a purpose. He had come to this valley 3 months ago, leasing a small, forgotten cabin on the edge of the national forest, a place with no neighbors and unreliable cell service. It was perfect. At his side, Ghost padded along, his gait as quiet and purposeful as Elias's. The German shepherd was old, nearly 11, and the noble black and tan of his coat was frosted with gray around his intelligent eyes and powerful muzzle. He was not a pet. He was a partner. They had served 2 tours together, Ghost's nose and ears an extension of Elias's own senses, a silent, intuitive alarm system that had saved their team more than once. The dog had retired from service a year before Elias, and when Elias finally walked away from it all, he had driven straight to the facility and signed the papers. They belonged together. In the quiet of the mountains, their bond had deepened into a language of shared glances and subtle shifts in posture. Ghost did not demand affection. He offered presence, a steady, grounding weight against the tide of Elias's thoughts. He would often sit and watch Elias with an expression of profound, almost judgmental wisdom, as if he were auditing the man's soul and finding it wanting, but not yet beyond repair. This morning was like most others. They had started before dawn, walking the familiar trails as the sky bled from charcoal to a pale, cold blue. The air was crisp, tasting of pine and damp earth. Elias let his mind drift, the rhythm of his steps a form of meditation. He focused on the world outside himself, the chatter of a squirrel in the branches above, the feel of the cool air on his face, the distant cry of a hawk circling on a thermal. He was trying to learn how to simply be in a place, rather than assess it for threats and cover. He was trying to unlearn a lifetime of training. Then it happened. Ghost, who was a few yards ahead, stopped dead. It was not the curious pause of a dog catching a rabbit's scent. This was different. His body went rigid, a statue of focused intensity. His head was up, ears pivoted forward, his nose working the air not with frantic sniffs, but with long, deep draws. One leg was lifted, frozen in mid-stride. Elias stopped instantly, his own senses snapping to high alert. The familiar landscape suddenly felt alien. The silence was no longer peaceful. It held its breath. Elias scanned the trees, his eyes tracing the familiar patterns of light and shadow, searching for the anomaly. He saw nothing, heard nothing. But he trusted the dog. Ghost's instincts had been honed in places where a strange smell could mean the difference between life and death. The dog's gaze was fixed on the high ridge to the west, a line of broken granite that separated their valley from the wild, unmapped territory beyond. "What is it, boy?" Elias murmured, his voice a low rumble that did not disturb the quiet. Ghost didn't move. His breathing was controlled, almost silent. He was locked onto something, a signal only he could receive. After a full minute, he lowered his head, let out a soft, almost inaudible whine from deep in his chest, and looked back at Elias. The look was clear. There. Something is wrong over there. Elias felt a familiar, unwelcome knot tighten in his gut. It was the feeling he had come here to escape, the cold hum of a problem to be solved, a threat to be assessed. He had promised himself he was done with that life. But the dog was insistent. With another look back to ensure Elias was following, Ghost broke from the trail and began to move purposefully up the steep, wooded slope toward the ridge. Elias hesitated for only a second. He had learned long ago, in the dust and heat of Kandahar, that ignoring Ghost was a mistake you only made once. With a quiet sigh of resignation, he adjusted his pack and followed. The climb was arduous. There was no path here, only a tangle of undergrowth, fallen logs, and loose scree. Ghost moved with an unnerving certainty, weaving through the thickets as if following an invisible road. Elias, his breathing steady and deep, focused on the dog's tail, a banner of purpose leading him away from his carefully constructed piece and toward something unknown. The scent on the air changed as they gained elevation. The clean pine was now tainted with something else, something acrid and metallic. It was the smell of rust, of decay, but not the natural decay of the forest. This was the slow, chemical death of something man-made. They reached the ridgeline an hour later, the trees thinning out to reveal a panoramic view of the valley behind them and a new, wilder vista ahead. But Ghost did not pause to take in the view. He led Elias along the spine of the ridge to a place where the rock fell away in a steep cliff. There, half buried in a clump of hardy mountain shrubs, was the first piece of the puzzle. It was a thick ceramic insulator, the color of a robin's egg, cracked and weathered but unmistakably artificial. A few feet away, nearly swallowed by the earth, was a heavy steel anchor bolt, a length of thick, rusted cable still attached to it. It was a guy wire anchor. Elias knelt, his fingers tracing the corroded metal. This was from something big, something that was meant to stand against the fierce mountain winds. Ghost was already moving again, his nose to the ground. He led Elias another 50 yards along the cliff edge to a small, hidden saddle between two granite tors. And there it was. It rose from the rock like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast, a lattice of rusted steel reaching for the sky. A radio tower. It was perhaps 150 feet tall, a skeletal pyramid of corroded angles and beams, almost perfectly camouflaged against the dark, lichen-streaked rock face behind it. It was old, decades old, judging by the patina of decay. Elias had studied the topographical maps of this entire region. He had memorized them. This tower was not on any of them. It did not officially exist. Ghost sat at the base of the structure, looking up at it, then back at Elias. His job was done. He had delivered the message. The rest was up to the man. Elias walked a slow circle around the tower's base. 3 of the 4 massive concrete footings were still intact, but the 4th had cracked, causing the entire structure to lean at a slight, precarious angle. The wind, funneled through the saddle, moaned softly as it passed through the steel latticework, a mournful, hollow sound. At the center of the base was a small, windowless hut, its walls made of corrugated metal panels the color of dried blood. The door, also steel, was slightly ajar, held open by a wedge of fallen rock. A sense of deep unease settled over Elias. This was not a fire lookout or a forest service relay. The construction was too heavy, too permanent, and its secrecy was deliberate. He drew the folding knife from his jacket pocket, its blade clicking open with a familiar, comforting snick. He nudged the door with his foot. It swung inward with a groan of rusted hinges, revealing a small, dark space. The air that flowed out was stale, thick with the dust of years and that same metallic tang. But there was something else, too. The faint, sharp smell of ozone. The scent of electricity. He paused, listening. Over the sighing of the wind, he could hear it, a low, rhythmic hum. Ghost stayed outside, his posture alert, a silent sentinel. Elias took a small tactical flashlight from his pack and stepped across the threshold. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a scene frozen in time. The single room was filled with racks of electronic equipment, all of it coated in a thick blanket of gray dust. Vacuum tubes, massive transformers, and coils of thick black cable lined the walls. It was technology from another era, the 1970s, maybe early 80s. Most of it was dead, silent. But the hum was coming from a single rack in the far corner. Elias moved toward it, his boots scuffing through the dust on the concrete floor. The beam of his light fell upon a reel-to-reel tape machine. It was a robust, industrial model, and incredibly, a single small green light glowed on its control panel. The 2 large reels were turning, slowly, almost imperceptibly. A thin brown ribbon of magnetic tape spooled from one to the other. Elias leaned closer. He couldn't understand how it could possibly have power. Then he saw a thick, sheathed cable running from the back of the machine up through a crude hole in the ceiling. He glanced up. On the roof, obscured from below, must be solar panels. Old, inefficient, but just enough, after all these years, to keep this one device alive. He put his ear close to the machine. Beneath the mechanical hum, he could hear something else, faint and distorted, coming from a small integrated speaker. It was a voice. A man's voice, worn thin by endless repetition, warped by the decay of the magnetic tape. It was a ghost in the machine. He found a volume knob, caked with grime. He turned it carefully. The static grew louder, and then the voice became clearer, thin and reedy, but resolute. It spoke a short, repeating sequence. 749218. They took the water. I am the only one left. I will not be silent. 45749218. They took the water. I am the only one left. I will not be silent. The numbers were spoken with a flat, precise cadence. The words that followed were filled with a weary, desperate conviction. The tape hissed for a few seconds. There was an audible click, and then the loop began again. Elias stood motionless in the dusty, humming darkness, the flashlight beam fixed on the turning reels. The silence he had sought in these mountains was gone. In its place was a voice that had been speaking into the void for decades, waiting for someone to hear. He felt the weight of that long vigil settle onto his shoulders. This was no longer just a discovery. It was a testament, and he was now its witness. He backed out of the hut slowly, pulling the door until it was almost closed, and stood with Ghost, looking at the leaning tower. The wind still moaned through the steel, but now it sounded less like mourning and more like a warning. He spent the rest of the day at the site, not touching anything further, but observing. He used his training to see the place not as a mystery, but as an operational environment. The tower was positioned for line-of-sight transmission, aimed southeast, toward the lower plains and the sprawl of distant cities. The hut was built for durability, not comfort. The solar array, which he confirmed by scrambling onto a nearby rock outcropping, was military-grade for its time, built to last. This was not the work of a hobbyist. This was a professional installation designed for one purpose: to send a message. The message itself was a beacon. 45749218. Coordinates: a latitude and a longitude. Elias pulled out his phone, which miraculously had a single bar of service on the exposed ridge. He entered the numbers into his mapping software. The point appeared on the screen, a blinking red dot in the middle of a vast, empty stretch of ranch land about 30 miles away, near the small town of Covenant Creek. They took the water. I am the only one left. I will not be silent. It was a story in 3 sentences: a crime, a witness, and a promise. The man on the tape had turned himself into a broadcast, a human signal that refused to die. Elias felt a reluctant kinship with him. He too was haunted by a single looping message in his own head, the memory of a choice made under fire, of a brother in arms left behind. The face of Sergeant Miller, the static-laced final transmission, the plume of smoke on the horizon. His own failure on a permanent loop. He knew he could not walk away from this. To ignore this voice would be a betrayal of a different kind, a quiet complicity in its erasure. The man on the tape had said, "I will not be silent." By finding it, Elias had become a part of that promise. He pulled out his phone again, and shielding it from the wind, recorded a full minute of the looping audio. The quality was poor, but the words were discernible. It was evidence. It was a start. Before leaving, he did one last thing. Using skills he hadn't employed in years, he scouted the area for any other signs of human passage. He found faint, overgrown tracks of a service road, long since reclaimed by the forest, leading down the backside of the ridge. And he found a single, more recent footprint not far from the hut, partially obscured by leaves. It was from a heavy-soled work boot, fresher than it should have been. Someone else had been here, not decades ago, maybe weeks, maybe days. The unease returned, sharper this time. He was not the only one who knew about this place. The drive to Covenant Creek the next morning was a descent back into a world Elias had tried to leave behind. The gravel road twisted down from the high country, and with every mile, the silence of the peaks was replaced by the mundane sounds of civilization. He saw fence posts, mailboxes, the distant glint of a pickup truck. He felt like a diver surfacing too quickly. Ghost sat in the passenger seat of the old Ford, his head held high, looking out the window with a calm dignity, as if he found the settled world of men to be a curious, slightly disappointing spectacle. Covenant Creek was a town of about 800 people, a cluster of brick and wood frame buildings huddled along a single main street. It was the kind of place that felt preserved in amber, a relic of a more self-reliant time. Elias parked in front of the county courthouse, a handsome 2-story stone building with a clock tower that was stopped at 3:15. He put on his jacket, though the day was warming. It was his armor. The county clerk's office was on the first floor, a large room that smelled of old paper, floor wax, and weak coffee. A tall, spare woman in her late 50s or early 60s stood behind a long oak counter, sorting through a stack of deeds. She had silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and wore no-nonsense glasses perched on her nose. She looked up as he entered, her eyes sharp and appraising. "Can I help you?" Her voice was flat, not unfriendly but efficient. This was the female authority figure, the gatekeeper of the town's recorded history. "I hope so," Elias said, his own voice quiet. "My name is Elias Thorne. I'm looking for some information on a piece of land." He spread his topographical map on the counter, its surface covered in his own pencil notations. He pointed to the ridge where he had found the tower. "Up here, I found a structure that's not marked on any map I can find." The woman, whose nameplate read Martha Riley, county clerk, leaned forward. She peered at the map, her expression unreadable. "A lot of things up in the high country aren't on the maps. Old mining claims, trappers' cabins. Most of them fell down 100 years ago." "This is different," Elias said. "It's a radio tower, professional build. Looks like it's from the 70s. Martha Riley's gaze sharpened. She looked from the map to his face, taking in the weathered lines around his eyes, the quiet intensity of his posture. "A radio tower? There's no broadcast license for anything in that sector. Never has been." She straightened up and crossed her arms. "Why are you interested, Mr. Thorne?" "I stumbled on it while hiking. It's still running." That got her attention. A flicker of something, curiosity, disbelief, crossed her face. "Running? After all this time?" Elias nodded. "There's a recorded message on a loop." She was silent for a long moment, studying him. Elias met her gaze without wavering. He knew this was a test. She was deciding whether he was a threat, a crank, or something else. Finally, she seemed to come to a decision. "All right," she said, her tone shifting from guarded to professional. "Let's see what the surveys say." She disappeared into a back room and returned a few minutes later with a massive, leather-bound plat book. The pages were brittle with age. She opened it to the corresponding section, her long, bony finger tracing the intricate lines of property deeds and survey markers. "Here's the quadrant," she said, tapping the page. "It's all designated national forest land, except for this one parcel." Her finger circled a small, oddly shaped square right where Elias had indicated the tower was. 160 acres. It was partitioned and sold off from an old mining patent back in 1978. "Who bought it?" Elias asked. She squinted at the faded, spidery script. "A holding company, Western Terra Dynamics. Never heard of them. It was a private cash sale, no mortgage, no liens. They paid their property taxes through a law firm in Billings for 20 years, and then, in '98, it just stopped. The county seized the land for non-payment in 2001. It's been county land ever since, though I doubt anyone from the department has ever set foot on it. It's too remote." Western Terra Dynamics. The name sounded bland, corporate, designed to be forgotten. "What about the coordinates from the message?" Elias asked. He pointed to the other location on his map, the dot in the ranch lands. Martha looked at the spot. "That's the old Miller place. Been owned by the same family for generations, until about 40 years ago. They sold out. Most of the small ranchers did around that time. Big agricultural conglomerate came in, bought up all the water rights, left the little guys high and dry. The Miller Ranch is now part of the Apex Agriculture portfolio." "Apex?" The name rang a distant bell. "Apex Resource Management," she clarified. "They're a multinational, own thousands of acres in this state. Water, timber, mineral rights. They have a regional office in Bozeman. Not the most popular folks around here." The pieces were starting to connect, forming the faint outline of a story. A big corporation, water rights, and a secret radio tower built on land purchased by a shell company. Martha seemed to be thinking along the same lines. She closed the book and looked at him again, her gaze direct. "This message you heard, what did it say?" Elias hesitated, then decided to trust her. "It gives a set of coordinates. Then it says, 'They took the water. I am the only one left. I will not be silent.'" A deep quiet fell over the office. Martha Riley took off her glasses and polished them slowly with a cloth. The stopped clock on the courthouse tower outside suddenly seemed deeply symbolic. Time had frozen around a single, unresolved moment. "Samuel Finch," she said at last, putting her glasses back on. "You need to talk to Samuel Finch. He's a retired Forest Service engineer. Handled all their radio communications for 40 years. If anyone knows about a phantom tower from that era, it's him. Lives in the yellow house at the end of Elm Street. Tell him I sent you." She paused, her expression serious. "And Mr. Thorne? Be careful. Digging up old secrets in this part of the country can be bad for your health." Samuel Finch lived in a small yellow house that was slowly being consumed by a wilderness of his own making. The yard was a chaotic museum of defunct technology, weather vanes, satellite dishes, and a tangle of antennas that looked like a metallic forest. The man himself, who answered the door after Elias's third knock, matched his environment. He was a small, bird-like man in his 80s, with a cloud of white hair and eyes that sparkled with restless intelligence behind thick, smudged spectacles. "Martha sent you, did she?" he chirped, before Elias could even speak. "Said you found a ghost. Come in, come in. Don't let the entropy out." The inside of the house was even more cluttered than the outside, a labyrinth of bookshelves, workbenches, and stacks of electronic components. The air smelled of solder, dust, and old books. Ghost, who had waited in the truck, would have hated it. Elias explained what he had found, showing Finch the photos of the tower and the hut on his phone. Finch peered at the screen, his nose almost touching it. "Oh, yes. Oh, my," he breathed, a slow smile spreading across his face. "A beauty. A classic TR-770 wideband relay. Military spec, but they sold a few to private contractors in the 70s. Built to survive anything short of a direct hit. I haven't seen one of those in the wild for 40 years. Do you know who might have installed it?" "Private job for sure," Finch said, tapping the phone screen. "See that custom antenna array? That's not standard. That's for a highly directional, low-power broadcast, designed to be hard to triangulate. Whoever built this didn't want to be found." He looked up, his bright eyes locking on Elias. "Now let me hear it. Let me hear the ghost." Elias played the recording. Finch closed his eyes, his head tilted, listening with an almost religious concentration. The reedy voice filled the cluttered workshop. 749218. They took the water. I am the only one left. I will not be silent." When it was over, Finch was silent for a long time. "Well," he said softly, "that explains a few things." "Explains what?" "The rumors," Finch said. "Back in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a geologist, brilliant man. His name was Alistair Crane. He was doing survey work for one of the big mining companies, looking for mineral deposits. But he found something else instead. He found proof that the company's operations further upstream were about to contaminate the entire aquifer that fed the lower valleys. The same aquifer the ranchers, like the Millers, depended on. Finch got up and began to pace, navigating the narrow paths through his hoard of technology. Alistair went to his bosses. They told him to bury the report. It would have cost them hundreds of millions to mitigate. He refused. A week later, the company fired him, discredited him. They put out the story that he was unstable, that his data was falsified. Then, he just disappeared. His wife said he just drove up into the mountains one day and never came back. Everyone assumed he'd taken his own life. But there were whispers. Some of us thought he'd gone into hiding, that he was planning to expose them somehow. Finch stopped and pointed a shaky finger at Elias's phone. That's him. I'd bet my life on it. That's Alistair Crane. He didn't run. He dug in. He built a fortress. He became a monument to the truth he'd found. I will not be silent. The old engineer's voice was filled with a mixture of awe and sorrow. He must have died up there, but he left his voice behind. The company he worked for, Elias said, the pieces clicking into place with a cold, final certainty. Was it called Western Terra Dynamics? Finch's eyes widened. That was the exploration subsidiary, yes, but the parent company, the one with the real power, was Apex Resource Management. The name hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. The polite, corporate name that Martha Riley had mentioned. The owners of the land where the coordinates pointed. The company that had bought up the water rights after the small ranchers were ruined. It was all one story. A story of greed, corruption, and a single man who had refused to be broken. He must have set the coordinates to point to the site of the original contamination, Finch mused. The source. His final piece of evidence. A feeling of immense weight settled on Elias. He was no longer just a witness. He was the custodian of Alistair Crane's legacy. He had stumbled into a 40-year-old war, and the last shot had just been fired. As he thanked Samuel Finch and walked back to his truck, he knew his quiet exile was over. The mountain had not given him silence. It had given him a mission. And this time, he swore to himself, he would not fail. This time, he would leave no one behind. If this chapter of a man's quiet life being interrupted by a call to duty has stirred something in you, if it reminds you that our past does not have to define our future, please take a moment to like, share, and leave a comment below. The world is full of forgotten voices and quiet injustices waiting for someone to listen. By subscribing to this channel, you help us continue to tell stories about faith, loyalty, and the courage to act. Sometimes the Lord doesn't ask us to move mountains. He simply asks us to stay and listen to the truth they hold. Elias returned to the tower the next day with a new sense of purpose. He brought supplies, water, food, a tarp, and his field notebook. He was no longer a visitor. He was a guardian. He set up a discreet camp in a cluster of pines with a clear view of the hut and the overgrown service road. He worked with the quiet efficiency of his old trade, creating a space that was nearly invisible, his movements blending with the natural rhythms of the forest. Ghost sat nearby, watchful and content. The dog seemed to understand the shift in Elias's demeanor. The man had a mission again, and that was a language Ghost understood better than any command. The first 24 hours were a vigil. The only sounds were the wind and the ceaseless looping voice from the hut. Elias spent the time meticulously documenting the site. He photographed the tower from every angle, the cracked footing, the corroded cables. He sketched the layout of the hut's interior in his notebook, mapping the racks of equipment. He did not touch the tape machine. It was a sacred object, a testament that had earned its right to speak. He felt Alistair Crane's presence in the humming solitude, a ghost of conviction that had soaked into the very steel and rock of the place. The afternoon of the second day he heard it, the low growl of an engine far down the mountain. Ghost heard it first, of course. The dog rose from his resting spot, his ears erect, a low rumble starting in his chest. Elias put a hand on his back, a silent command to hold. He moved to his observation point, a narrow gap in the rocks, and raised his binoculars. A single vehicle was making its way up the barely passable service road. It was a pristine black SUV, its polished finish a stark intrusion in the wild landscape. It moved slowly, carefully, its driver clearly unaccustomed to such terrain. It parked at the end of the road, a few hundred yards below the tower. A man got out. He was in his late 40s or early 50s, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that seemed absurdly out of place. He was tall, with neatly combed dark hair, and the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being in charge. He moved with a smooth, unhurried gait as he walked up the final incline toward the hut. This was him, the polite antagonist. Elias stepped out from behind the rocks to meet him, positioning himself between the newcomer and the hut. Ghost was at his heel, silent but radiating a coiled tension. The man in the suit stopped about 20 feet away, his expression one of mild, pleasant surprise. He did not seem threatened, merely curious. "Well, hello there," he said, his voice smooth and modulated, the voice of a boardroom. "I must say, you're the last thing I expected to find up here." "This is private property," the man continued, gesturing vaguely at the landscape. "Though I'll admit, we've been a bit lax in our upkeep." "It's county land," Elias stated, his voice flat. The man gave a small, indulgent smile. "A procedural error, I assure you. One we are in the process of rectifying. My name is Davies. I'm with Apex Resource Management." He extended a hand. Elias did not take it. He just stood there, a quiet obstacle. Davies let his hand drop without a trace of awkwardness. His smile remained fixed. "And you are?" "A hiker." "A very dedicated one," Davies observed, his eyes flicking from Elias's worn boots to the professional pack leaning against a rock. "Look, I don't want any trouble. This facility is old company property. It's a relic, an environmental hazard. We've been contracted to conduct a final survey and then decommission it. Safely, of course." Decommission. The word was so clean, so sterile. It meant to erase, to silence. "It's not a hazard," Elias said. "It's a historical site." Davies' smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the edges. "Historical? It's a pile of rusting junk. The equipment is obsolete. Out of context, it's meaningless. Our engineers need to assess the integrity of the structure and remove any sensitive materials." "What sensitive materials?" "Old data tapes, mercury switches, that sort of thing," Davies said with a dismissive wave. "Standard reclamation procedure. We'll be bringing a crew up in a day or two to begin the work. I'd appreciate it if you'd clear the area. For your own safety, you understand." The conversation was a masterclass in bureaucratic misdirection. Every word was designed to minimize, to obscure, to drain the situation of its moral weight. Davies wasn't lying, precisely. He was simply using a different, emptier language. "The tower stays," Elias said. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. For the first time, a flicker of annoyance crossed Davies' smooth features. "I don't think you're in a position to make that determination. This is a simple matter of corporate liability and environmental stewardship." "This is a matter of a man named Alistair Crane," Elias said, his voice dropping lower. The name hit Davies like a physical blow. The polite mask fell away for a fraction of a second, revealing a flash of cold, hard calculation in his eyes. He recovered instantly, but the shift was undeniable. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said, his voice now a shade colder. "You're trespassing on land that is under claim by my company. I'm asking you politely to leave. If you refuse, I'll have to involve the sheriff and our legal department. It would be unpleasant for you. Your name, your history, it would all become a matter of public record. A man like you, I imagine, prefers his privacy." It was a threat, delivered with the calm precision of a surgeon. He had already looked into Elias. He knew who he was, or at least what he had been. Elias didn't respond with words. He simply stood his ground, an immovable object. The standoff hung in the thin mountain air, a silent battle of wills. And then, Ghost acted. The dog had been a statue of taut muscle at Elias's side. Now, without a sound, he took 2 steps forward. He didn't bark. He didn't snap. He simply lifted his head, looked directly at Davies, and curled his lip back from his teeth, exposing the long white line of his canines. A low growl, like the sound of grinding rock, vibrated in his chest. It was not the sound of an angry dog. It was the sound of a predator making a promise. Davies, for all his boardroom poise, was human. He took an involuntary step backward, his eyes wide with primal fear. The suit and the smooth talk were useless against this ancient, unambiguous message. He had been judged, and he had been found wanting. He stared at the dog for a moment. Then his gaze shifted to Elias, his eyes now filled with a cold, pure animosity. The pretense was over. "You're making a grave mistake," Davies said, his voice tight. He turned without another word, walked back to his SUV, and drove away, his tires spitting gravel. Elias stood and watched until the vehicle was out of sight. He placed a hand on Ghost's head. The dog relaxed, the growl subsiding, and leaned his weight against Elias's leg. "Good boy," Elias murmured. The first round was over. But he knew Davies would be back, and he would not come back alone. The politeness was gone. Now, the force would come. Elias looked up at the leaning tower, a silent promise to the ghost in the machine. He was not just a witness anymore. He was a soldier in a 40-year-old war, and he had just chosen his side. The storm came just after dusk the next day. It was not a surprise. Elias had been watching the bruised purple clouds gather over the western peaks all afternoon. He had felt the drop in pressure, the electric tension in the air. The weather was turning, mirroring the escalation he knew was coming. He had used the day to prepare, not for a fight, but for a siege. He reinforced his small camp, secured his gear, and made a final detailed entry in his notebook. He had already emailed his photos, the audio recording, and a full summary of his findings to Martha Riley and a trusted journalist contact from a life he thought he had left behind. It was an insurance policy. If he failed, the story would not die with him. The first drops of rain were fat and cold, striking the tarp above him with loud, percussive pops. Soon it was a downpour, a solid sheet of water that blurred the landscape into a gray mist. The wind howled through the tower's latticework, a rising symphony of shrieks and groans. Thunder cracked overhead, so close it shook the ground, and flashes of lightning momentarily illuminated the scene in stark, brilliant white. It was in the blinding glare of one of these flashes that he saw them. 2 sets of headlights struggling up the muddy service road. Davies was back, and he had brought his crew. Ghost was already on his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest, his hackles raised. Elias calmed him with a touch. "Easy, boy. Let's see what they do." He moved to his observation point, the rain plastering his hair to his head and running in rivulets down his face. Through his binoculars, he saw Davies's SUV and a heavy-duty work truck slide to a stop. 4 men got out, dressed in dark rain gear. Davies stayed in his vehicle. 2 of the men carried heavy tool bags. The third carried a portable generator. The 4th man, broad-shouldered and moving with a familiar weary posture, hung back. He looked like he didn't want to be there. This was the conflicted insider. They weren't here to talk. They were here to cut, to dismantle, to erase. They started toward the hut, their flashlight beams cutting erratically through the deluge. Elias felt a cold calm settle over him. His training took over, his mind working with a detached clarity. He analyzed their approach, their equipment, their body language. He could intercept them. He could use the terrain, the storm, his skills to delay them, to stop them. The mission was to protect the hut, to protect the tape, to protect Alistair Crane's voice. That was the objective. He was about to move, to slip like a shadow through the storm-lashed trees, when a sound ripped through the night that was not thunder. It was the tortured screech of failing metal. Elias looked up. A section of the tower's upper latticework, weakened by decades of rust and battered by the ferocious wind, had broken free. A jagged piece of steel, 20 feet long, was cartwheeling down through the rain-swept darkness, directly toward the spot where he was crouched. He had no time to react, no time to think. There was only the roaring in his ears and the black shape falling from the sky. Then, something slammed into him, a solid 100-pound weight hitting his side with the force of a linebacker. It was Ghost. The dog had launched himself at Elias, driving him sideways, away from the point of impact. They tumbled together down a short, muddy embankment as the massive piece of steel crashed into the rocks where Elias had been kneeling a split second before, shattering the granite with a sickening crunch. Elias landed hard, the wind knocked out of him. He lay there for a second, disoriented, the rain cold on his face. Then he heard a sound that cut through the storm's fury and pierced him to the core. A high-pitched, agonized yelp of pain. It was Ghost. Elias scrambled to his partner's side. The dog was trying to get up, his back legs scrabbling in the mud. A dark, jagged shard of rock, a piece of shrapnel from the impact, was embedded deep in his flank. Blood, dark and thick, was already soaking his fur, mingling with the rain and mud. And in that instant, the storm, the tower, and Davies's men all vanished. The world contracted to this one spot, to the sight of his partner, his friend, bleeding in the mud. The memory, the one he had run from, slammed into him with the force of the falling steel. The dust and searing heat of Afghanistan, the chaos of an ambush, the crackle of the radio, Sergeant Miller's voice calling for support, his position overrun. And the impossible choice: press the main assault to achieve the primary objective, or divert a fire team to rescue Miller, risking the entire operation. He was the commander on the ground. It was his call. He had looked at the map, at the enemy positions, at the narrow window of opportunity. He had chosen the mission. Leave no man behind, the creed they all lived by. But a mission was not a man. He had made the cold, tactical choice. They had won the battle, and Miller, captured, had died days later in enemy hands. The mission succeeded. The man was gone. He had lived with the ghost of that decision every day since. Now here it was again. A different kind of battlefield, a different kind of war, but the same terrible choice. The mission: protect the hut, the evidence, the legacy of a man who refused to be silenced. The objective was 50 yards away. Davies's men were closing in. He could still stop them. But Ghost was here, bleeding, his life draining into the cold earth. His partner, who had just saved his life. He looked from the hut, its dark shape barely visible through the rain, to the trusting, pain-filled eyes of the dog at his feet. The mission, or the man? The choice was instantaneous. There was no debate, no tactical calculation. There was only a profound, gut-wrenching certainty. He had made the wrong choice once. He would not make it again. "I've got you, boy," he whispered, his voice thick. "I've got you." Ignoring the men moving toward the hut, ignoring the screech of a cutting tool starting up, Elias focused entirely on Ghost. He gently, expertly, examined the wound. It was deep, but it had missed the vital organs. He had to stop the bleeding and get the rock out. He pulled the med kit from his pack, his hands moving with practiced speed. He had done this under fire a dozen times, but never with so much at stake. This was not about saving a soldier. This was about saving a piece of his own soul. He lost track of time. His world was the wound, the dog's ragged breathing, the feel of the sterile gauze in his hands. The sounds of Davies' crew, the grinding of metal, a shout of triumph, were distant, irrelevant noise. He had made his choice. He had chosen loyalty. He had chosen to stay. He had chosen his partner over the mission. He had failed Alistair Crane, but he would not fail Ghost. He had just finished bandaging the wound, a tight, professional dressing, when a figure emerged from the rain and stood over him. It was the fourth man, the conflicted insider. He held a large flashlight, its beam illuminating the scene. Elias looked up, his body tensing, ready to defend his wounded dog. The man, whose name tag visible on his rain gear read Cole, looked from the bandaged dog to Elias's face. He didn't look hostile. He looked weary. He was younger than Elias, maybe late 30s, but his eyes held a similar mileage. "He a shepherd?" Cole asked, his voice low, almost drowned out by the storm. Elias nodded, his hand resting on Ghost's head. "My kid's got a shepherd," Cole said. He looked back toward the hut, where the sounds of destruction were now winding down. Then he looked at Elias again. He saw the choice Elias had made. He had seen him abandon the strategic objective to save his partner. It was a choice a soldier would understand. Cole unclipped a small waterproof pouch from his own belt and tossed it into Elias's lap. "Extra clotting sponges and sutures, from our truck's med kit. That looks like it needs stitches." Elias stared at him, stunned. "He's watching," Cole said, jerking his head toward the distant glow of the SUV's interior lights where Davies sat. "But he's an idiot. He thinks it's all on that tape." Cole took a step closer, lowering his voice even more. "The real logs aren't on the tape. Crane was smarter than that. He digitized everything before he died. The full geological reports, the internal company memos, everything. He stored it on a hidden solid-state drive wired into the main transmitter panel. The access code is on a yellow sticky note on the back of the panel. Davies is so focused on destroying the symbolic evidence, he doesn't even know the real proof exists." Cole looked at Ghost one last time. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Then he turned and melted back into the rain and darkness, leaving Elias alone with his wounded dog and a new, unexpected weapon. The tide had just turned. The morning broke with a fragile, pristine clarity. The storm had passed, scrubbing the air clean and leaving the world dripping and renewed. A pale sun climbed over the eastern peaks, casting long shadows and setting the wet foliage alight. The only sounds were the steady drip of water from the pines and the soft sigh of the wind. The war, for the moment, was over. Elias sat with his back against a rock, Ghost resting beside him, the dog's head in his lap. He had spent the long, dark hours after the storm tending to his partner. He had cleaned and stitched the wound with the supplies Cole had given him, his movements precise and gentle. Ghost had borne the pain with a stoic trust that was almost more heartbreaking than the injury itself. Now the dog was stable, sleeping fitfully, but alive. Elias stroked his head, feeling the steady, rhythmic warmth of his breathing. He had kept his promise. After Davies' crew had left, their work of destruction complete, Elias had made his way to the hut. The door was torn from its hinges. Inside, the scene was one of calculated vandalism. The reel-to-reel machine was smashed, the tape shredded and burned in a corner. They had done what they came to do. They had silenced the voice. But Cole's words had given him a new path. Behind the main transmitter panel, just as he had said, was a small, grimy yellow sticky note. On it, in faded pen, was a single word: Eureka 78. He had found the solid-state drive, a small, crudely waterproofed box no bigger than a deck of cards, wired deep within the guts of the machinery. Using a portable power cell from his own pack, he had connected it to his ruggedized laptop. The password worked. A single folder opened, containing dozens of files. For the rest of the night, by the dim light of his screen, Elias had read Alistair Crane's story in his own words. There were the geological surveys, dense with data, proving beyond any doubt that Apex knew their mining operations would poison the aquifer. There were scanned copies of internal memos, ordering Crane to alter his findings. There was a draft of a letter to the EPA, which was never sent. And there was a personal journal. In it, Crane detailed his growing disillusionment and his decision to make a final stand. He wrote of building the tower in secret, of his race against time as his own health failed, likely from exposure to the very contaminants he was trying to expose. The last entry was brief. The work is done. The voice is set. Let who has ears to hear listen. I will not be silent. Elias had compressed the files, attached them to 2 separate emails, and sent them. One went to the journalist, the other to Martha Riley, with a short, simple message. The proof you need, for Alistair Crane. He hit send, and 40 years of silence was finally broken. Now, in the quiet morning light, he heard the sound of approaching vehicles. Not the aggressive growl of Davies's SUV, but the steady, professional hum of official cars. A pair of state police cruisers and a dark sedan with government plates pulled up. Martha Riley got out of the sedan, followed by 2 men in suits who had the unmistakable bearing of federal investigators. Martha walked up the slope toward him, her face grim but resolute. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze falling on the bandaged dog. Is he all right? He'll make it, Elias said. I got your email, she said. Sent it up the chain of command. It seems you kicked over a very large, very old rock. The state AG's office and the EPA have been looking for a way into Apex's regional operations for years. This, she gestured toward the silent tower, is the key. Just then, another vehicle arrived, a rental car pulling up behind the official vehicles. A woman got out. She was tall, with dark hair and a familiar, worried expression on her face. It was his sister, Sarah. Elias felt his carefully constructed walls threaten to crumble. He hadn't seen her in 2 years, not since he had walked away from everything and everyone. He hadn't answered her calls or her letters. Sarah walked toward him, her eyes scanning the scene, the police, the investigators, him sitting on the ground, a wounded dog in his lap. She looked tired, but relieved. Martha called me, she said, her voice soft. She said you might need a ride home. It was a clumsy excuse, a bridge across the silence he had created between them. Elias didn't know what to say. The man who had left 2 years ago would have turned away, unable to meet her gaze, ashamed of the ghost he had become. But he wasn't that man anymore. He had faced his ghost in the storm and chosen a different path. He looked up at her, and for the first time in years, he let her see him. Really see him. The regret, the exhaustion, but also the flicker of something new, something solid. I'm glad you're here, he said. And he meant it. Sarah's face softened, the worry lines easing. She knelt beside him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it closed a chasm of unspoken pain. You did the right thing, Eli, she whispered. Later that day, as the federal team in white hazmat suits began the meticulous work of preserving the site, another SUV came down the road. This one was unmarked. It stopped, and Mr. Davies was escorted out by two grim-faced men. He was no longer wearing his tailored suit, but a rumpled shirt and slacks. The polite mask was gone, replaced by a look of haggard disbelief. He saw Elias standing with his sister, Ghost now resting comfortably in the back of her car. Davies's eyes, for a moment, were filled with a pure, uncomprehending rage. He had destroyed the tape. He had won. How could this be happening? He didn't see the yellow sticky note, the conflicted soldier, or the choice made in a storm. He only saw the man who had refused to move, the man who had cost him everything. Then he was placed in the back of the sedan, and it drove away, taking him toward a future of legal battles and public disgrace. The secret of the tower was safe. Alistair Crane's voice would now be heard in courtrooms and news reports. His name would be cleared, his legacy honored. The land, Martha told him, would be designated a protected historical site. The tower would remain, a silent monument to the man who built it. Elias, with his sister's help, gently loaded Ghost into her car. As he was about to get in, he paused and looked back at the leaning tower, its rusted steel glowing in the afternoon sun. He had come to these mountains seeking an ending, a quiet place to disappear. Instead, he had found a beginning. He had been given a second chance to make the right choice, to choose the man over the mission. And in doing so, he had found something he thought he had lost forever. A way back to himself. He had chosen to stay, and in staying, he had found his own quiet form of redemption. Months later, the autumn sun cast a golden haze over the valley. The aspens had turned a brilliant, trembling yellow, and the air was crisp with the promise of coming snow. Elias stood on the shore of the lake near his cabin, skipping a flat stone across the glassy surface. It bounced 4, 5, 6 times before sinking into the deep blue. Ghost sat beside him, his posture regal. A faint silver scar marked his flank, a permanent reminder of the storm on the ridge. He was fully recovered, though his age now showed in a certain deliberateness in his movements. He watched the ripples spread across the water with a serene, contemplative air, as if pondering the physics of it all. Elias was no longer a man in exile. He had not left. He had stayed. He had taken a volunteer position with the county's search and rescue team, his skills once again having a purpose. But this time, a purpose of finding, not fighting. He spoke to his sister every week. The silences between them were no longer chasms of pain, but comfortable spaces of shared understanding. He still wore the olive field jacket and the military watch, but they no longer felt like the uniform of a ghost. They were just clothes, tools for a life lived in the open air. The memories of Afghanistan were still there, but they no longer had the power to command him. They were a part of his story, a scar like the one on Ghost's flank, a reminder of a lesson learned, a debt paid. The tower still stood on the high ridge, visible from certain points in the valley if you knew where to look. It was a landmark now, a point on a map. Alistair Crane's story had become a local legend, a cautionary tale of corporate greed and a testament to individual courage. His name was on a small bronze plaque at the trailhead that now led to the site. Elias looked at his reflection in the still water. The face that looked back was weathered and lined, but the eyes were clear. The haunted look was gone, replaced by a quiet calm. He was no longer running. He was home. Ghost nudged his hand with his nose, a soft, wet touch. Elias smiled and scrubbed the dog's thick fur. "Ready to go, boy?" he murmured. The dog let out a soft woof of assent. Together they turned and walked back toward the cabin, their two silhouettes moving as one into the warm light of the afternoon. The silence of the mountains was all around them, but it was no longer an empty void. It was full, peaceful, and profound. It was the sound of earned peace. This story is a reminder that sometimes the quietest places hold the most important truths, and that the deepest wounds can be healed not by running, but by turning to face them. If you are watching this while carrying the weight of a past silence, know that you are not alone. Redemption is not always a grand, dramatic event. More often, it is a quiet miracle, a simple choice to do the right thing, to choose loyalty, to protect the vulnerable. It is the strength to stay when everything in you screams to run. These are the moments where God's work is truly done, not in the thunder and the earthquake, but in the still, small voice that calls us to be better than we were yesterday. May you find the courage to listen for that voice in your own life. May you be given a second chance to make the right choice, and may God bless you and keep you always. Share this story if you believe in the power of loyalty and the quiet miracles that await us all. Comment with your own story of a second chance and subscribe so we can continue to build this community of hope together.